Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. Can everyone hear me? On behalf of the MIT Architecture Alumni Group Board, we'd like to welcome you to our virtual roundtable. My name is Andrea Lamberti. I'm a practicing architect in New York City. Michael Joyce, an architect practicing in Boston, and Eldante Winston, an architect and professor based in Manhattan, Kansas, and I are all three members of MITArcha's, MIT Architecture Alumni's State of Design Initiative, and we will be moderating today's discussion. Please feel free to send questions to our panelists in the chat, in the Q&A box, and there may be time to answer questions at the end. And for those of you who are alumni from MIT's Department of Architecture, we encourage you to join our growing community through the MIT Alumni Association online platform. Now we will be getting started with our program. The training of an architect begins through learning general principles while in school and experiencing the world. That training expands, allows students to explore their own interests. A student may begin by designing a room or a pavilion and then move on to larger structures over the course of their studio trajectory. Out of school, architects continue to integrate cycles of intense learning alongside assuming greater and greater responsibilities as professionals. But it's often the case that market forces and demand for services almost never align precisely with a single architect's training and areas of interest in order to yield sufficient work that would sustain a single firm or a single practitioner. And therefore, as many of us know, architectural practices necessarily diversify to embrace varying project typologies or to expand their reach geographically. Architects may teach, in addition to practicing, they may develop and offer multiple specializations, such as interior design, urban design, or master planning. The architects we've invited to join us today have all designed their practices in new and interesting ways, not only in response to market forces, but also, very importantly, as a proactive reflection of their commitment to service, community, and education. We've invited them to share how they have expanded the definition of practice to support their design and problem-solving interests, and to show us, in addition, how designing the education of architects is supporting these new foundations upon which tomorrow's practitioners will build their practices. Michael?
Thank you, Andrea. I'm Michael Joyce, and I'm ARC 91, and I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to see everybody. I'm going to present the history of the State of Design Initiative. The MIT MITArcha State of Design Committee was created to spark open conversations and give alumni a space to share ideas about how design is changing. The initiative began in 2022 with a basic question: how do we design? Inviting alumni to reflect on how their MIT experience has shaped the way they approach the challenges of today. In 2023 and 2024, we continued this work with calls for papers on three themes: environment, ideation, and practice and technology. Alumni from more than 50 years of Course 4 history sent in their perspectives, which we shared at in-person events during the Alumni Leadership Conference. These gatherings brought together students, faculty, staff, and alumni to highlight current work and the lasting influence of an MIT design education. Now, we're bringing selected alumni design thought leaders into a roundtable discussion to talk about the state of design, building on the essay themes while looking ahead to the future of the field and the role MIT architecture can play in addressing urgent environmental challenges. Although this roundtable wraps up the recent phase of State of Design Initiative, we see it as just a start. We hope the purpose and momentum of the State of Design will continue to grow and share ideas between Course 4 alumni. So the initiative was established using three very important questions. How do we design in response to challenges posed by climate change? How do we design to advance social equity and broaden inclusion in practice today? And finally, how do we design using AI to affect positive within the practice of architecture? Thank you. On to Eldante, our colleague on MITArcha board.
We will now move on to our panelists, and rather than reading their very impressive bios, we will let them introduce themselves after a little prompt. Our first panelist is Marie Law Adams. Marie, your firm's work addresses the civic needs of overlooked or shadowed communities, finding ways to support and encourage them through architectural and infrastructural solutions that return value to their neighborhood. Please share with us the beginnings of your practice and discuss how your work best illustrates your approach to design.
Okay, thank you, Eldante, Andrea, and Michael. I'm going to share my screen. I'm very happy to be here in the presence of MIT alums and the really great panel. I've enjoyed the opportunity over the last several months to kind of hear about their work and excited to hear more today. My name is Marie Law Adams. I earned my Master of Architecture at MIT in 2006, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I see MIT relating or influencing the work that I'm doing today. I just wanted to start by talking about the we that I'll be referring to in my presentation. I run a practice called Landing Studio with my partner, Dan Adams, and we have a small firm of 5 right now with Ryan, Chris, and Jake, but also a lot of folks who've really contributed to this work in the past. You might be able to tell from this picture, we haven't gone very far from Cambridge in our practice. This is East Somerville, and this is a picture of our office. The work that we do, we like to describe it as bringing high quality public realm spaces to places that have historically sort of been impacted by industrial and infrastructural uses in different ways. This is on the shore of the Chelsea Creek in Chelsea, where you're seeing some kids playing basketball alongside Massachusetts' largest road salt stockpile. Our work is really pretty local. The 4 kind of what we call long projects that have really occupied our practice for 10 years and more, are kind of the spine of what we do. You'll see them all here. They're all on the kind of industrial or formerly industrial waterfronts of Boston and the surrounding areas, and they're all pretty close to where we are, which is also close to Cambridge, where I started my MArch. We do work beyond these kind of longer term projects. A lot of, projects that involve lighting, sometimes buildings, installations, and so on, furniture, that kind of help us hone the ideas that we end up incorporating into these longer term projects. So I wanted to talk about the ways that I kind of look back at my experience at MIT, and I relate to it in 2 ways, actually. One, as my time as an architecture student, and I really gravitated towards faculty there who were thinking a lot about the kind of urban systems that impact the built environment. That was really excited me about architecture, and also those who kind of thought about architecture as something beyond the practice of just making buildings. And I'm going to kind of associate that with some of the early work in our practice, almost the kind of first decade of Landing Studio, our Chelsea Salt projects, and then work that we've been doing with MassDOT. And then actually, I spent about 6 years as an architect teaching in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. And that was a kind of whole different experience where it really kind of foregrounded the kind of social processes that affect the built environment, how communities have been impacted by the practices of building and demolition, and also really kind of decentering design from the conversation of what affects people's everyday lives in cities. I'm going to connect that with some of the more recent work that our office has been doing. And I'll kind of just really introduce how each of these projects started and maybe kind of we can talk in Q&A about some of the more details of it. So this is actually a photograph back from when I was a student at MIT when our first project started, and we're still working in Chelsea. This is a road salt distribution facility in Chelsea Creek, and you can kind of see this impact or intersection of the really large scale of global industry and the kind of much smaller scale of a New England neighborhood here. And, you know, some of our observations of the kind of really dynamic quality of this landscape and how it affected the community drew us to the practice of art and thinking about how to engage with this process in a way that we could as students, which started to kind of initiate dialogue as well and kind of open up a conversation about the role of this space in the city. And this led really directly into the first 10 years of work that we had at Landing Studio that was trying to think about how do you kind of do something, develop a project that is both industrial and a place for public access. For a lot of reasons, this was kind of the only solution for being able to kind of engage Chelsea residents on their own waterfront, was to think about how could it be done in such a way that it could be done in concert with industry. And this had a lot to do with kind of physical urban analysis, thinking about the regulatory frameworks that affect the spaces of industry, but how do you start to kind of frame them in different ways to open up opportunities for new kinds
2
of
minutes.
spaces that mix industry and public open space. And for in this project, it really ended up being something about seasonality and playing off of the seasonal nature of the road salt industry. This led into work that we were doing, that we did later with the Department of Transportation, where we're seeing a lot of similar issues borne by large-scale infrastructure that really fragmented communities. And some of the kind of lessons that we learned from the Chelsea work were brought into this, specifically in terms of how do you take transportation funding and start to think about that as in a way that can actually produce public, high-quality public spaces in areas of infrastructure. So that had a lot to do with redesigning stormwater infrastructure in such a way that it's made visible and uses landscape systems and mobility systems to reconnect communities that have been separated. We learned also a big lesson in all of this that the kind of community engagement piece is really critical. This project went through a sort of traditional public agency-led outreach and engagement process that really just fizzled as soon as there was a change in administration in Massachusetts. And this kind of taught us that the kind of sustainable long-term effects of
We're at time.
projects like this really do depend on them coming from communities. And so it sounds like my time's up. I'll stop there and hand it off to the next person.
Thanks, Marie. Our next presenter is Robert Benson. Bob, you began your career in both small and large firms in Chicago, then seized a shift in the economy to embark on your solo career, and now have a successful practice that promotes the power of well-designed spaces. Share with us the importance of creativity in design.
Hey, Eldante, thanks. Just wanted to make sure that I was unmuted. I started my career, my name is Robert Benson, MArch 96, at a large firm with 333 people. Then I moved to a 33-person firm, and then I moved to a 3-person firm. So I've sort of worked at all the scales. And I've realized that all of those skills offer something, resources, opportunity, access, but they also take something away, and that could be authorship or deep engagement. So my practice, Racer Design Studio, is really trying to get after some of the things that I've learned and focus on designing with rather than for. This poem on the screen right now, I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendo, the blackbird whistling or just after, is a huge reminder for us. When what you say versus how you say it, when you're experiencing something amazing and then you haven't had a chance to process it yet, the distance between those things is very architectural. And so being able to work on what does architecture really provide for society starts with the spaces. And it's not in the typical sense, I would argue it's the agency that we can provide the public. Um, it's something that's hard to put on Instagram. It's hard to photograph. The space that people inhabit and how they use it, how they feel, is something that we're really after at Racer. The nature of the space isn't just sort of the big grand gestures. Very often it's the void in the cladding. In this case, this is the Student Center at Western Michigan University, and that's those voids in the fins are actually the same as the trees on the right and left. It's the light going through a canopy of a tree, such that when it goes into the building, it creates the dappled light that you'd expect as if you were standing under or sitting under a tree. Light itself can make space. It's not just the mass void relationship. Um, and really being creative about that's important. But the space that's inside, and this is a 3-story space inside that student center, and it really sort of exemplifies what I'm trying to get at about how spaces can give agency. This connector, this point, the heart of the building actually is a place that people move through, a place that people rest. One, they could be by themselves, they could be in a small group. We love the fact that they'll use it any way they see fit and a way that works for them. And again, it can be in small groups working together. It can be in concentration, but it also can be a group of people listening to each other or even a marching band. And I think that's the kind of thing that space is a living, breathing element in the design. Which reminds us the second point that architecture can be alive. We think it's alive. It's not a static thing. And how you design it can actually make a huge difference. So it can be a great attractor. It can be the kind of thing that people really are, it's irresistible and sticky and they want to find out more about it. It can also be mysterious. It can be, they don't quite understand what they're looking at. This is a chemistry building in Milwaukee where the skin begins to kind of dissolve. And much like trying to solve a scientific problem, you have to move up to the building and all the way around it to really understand it. It can also be a surprise. It can be something you didn't expect. It can be aggressive. It can be funny. It can be whimsical. But again, the mysteriousness of it is important. It can also work for a kindergartner to break down the scale of the building, where they can determine which is their kindergarten in a large building and make it more welcoming. And of course, just the way that it handles the light and gives an experience. But then that all really drives down to what does it mean and what are we trying to do and make those connections between people and create places that people want to be and for those really important conversations or just
2
having
minutes.
fun. Thank you. Really, really love the little girl climbing into that window there in the kindergarten, or the adult that gets away into that window to have a conversation or the career tech where you can we really analyzed the way the program was put together so that you would walk into a courtyard of a building and from that courtyard look around the building and see any one of a number of future careers for yourself: digital media, engineering, cybersecurity, building trades, still taking the higher order messages of education, math, science, etc. And but really creating that safe place where you can look around and you can understand what's available to you. And you can do it together. You're going to collaborate. You're going to enjoy it. And we're going to create a place where industry can come in. And there's lots of flexibility. And there's a wide range of expertise. And having the opportunity to create these kinds of connections for people, I think, is where architecture can really present its greatest value. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Our next panelist is Dr. Joseph Choma. Joseph, your PhD in unique structures and computational tools used to develop and implement them provides you with a unique vantage point towards today vis-a-vis education and practice. At Florida Atlantic University, you teach first-year students. Tell us how your research has informed design education and practice.
Well, thank you again for inviting me to participate on this panel. It's a real honor to be here. And so I've titled this presentation Designing Practice in response to that prompt. As what's mentioned is I'm the director of the School of Architecture at Florida Atlantic University. I'm also a tenured full professor of architecture, and I'm also the director of the Foldable Structures and Materials Lab. And so in many ways, the way I design practice is through these three roles of leadership, teaching, and research. So first, leadership. So as the director of the School of Architecture, I'm not responsible for designing every single course, but more so about how I understand the overview and the shape of the entire curriculum. I also work with the faculty to collectively develop a vision and the benchmarks associated with that vision. So our vision is to combine and blend innovative research methods with professional constraints, and we're looking at three strands: technology, environment, and community. As part of that vision, especially the research portion of that vision, we're also been transforming design studio spaces, which historically has just been a series of desks in a space, into research labs that are also teaching labs. So how does the space itself become an instrument to think with? So this is our creative AI lab where we have human-machine interfaces, physical, digital interactions, all in real time. And then here's an example of a structure that's built using augmented reality as an assisted fabrication technique, where we have more than 100 bespoke connections. And as a school, it's this back and forth balancing act between understanding normative constraints as poetic design opportunities, like you can see here. This is an aviation museum designed by one of our fifth-year architecture students. But then also we're teaching them how to design and shift from, instead of focusing on the design of the end product, start to design the processes, systems, and workflows to tackle some of the most challenging problems of our time. And so here's an example of a student who's using acoustic simulation software, generative AI, to design an urban fabric or form or massing that starts to work according to outdoor performances. Within my teaching, as what was mentioned, I teach and coordinate the first year design studios, which I think gets to the essence of design. And so I'm going to show you a short 1-minute video that kind of goes through our first year design studio review. So within the first year, students are learning about computational thinking and making. They're learning about design as an iterative, reflective process, learning how to go back and forth between digital and analog tooling. And they're also kind of working through representational abstractions. So here you can look at shapes carving shapes or Boolean operations, learning about solid void. Here you can see plane surface volume, learning about folding, how you can create structural depth through folds, how you can go from something two-dimensional to something three-dimensional, almost teach them about manufacturing or fabrication. And again, design as an iterative reflective process. Here's ruled surfaces or generating curvature with a series of straight lines. And fundamentally, the students here are creating a series of objects to think with that challenge what architecture is and what architecture can become. And then the next semester, the students take one of these curiosities and they use that as a starting point to design a very small building. In this case, it's a visitor center for Shark Valley, which is part of the Everglades National Park. So we have this large open air canopy with a simple object building underneath it. Now, within my own research, here's an example of some of my research over the last 12 years or so, where it's really at the intersection of mathematics, geometry, materials, means and methods of construction, and structure. And earlier, I was interested in something like this, where I called this materializing mathematics. So you're really demystifying digital tools with sine and cosine, but using it as a way to simulate structures that are either tensile structures or inflatable structures, similar to that of Friado. However, now I've become more interested in folding as something that is in between the mathematical world and the material world. And so now I'm going to show you a short video that goes into some of my folding research. I am Joseph Choma, a leading expert in foldable structures and materials. So why am I so interested in folding? Well, as soon as you fold a sheet of material, you gain structural depth without adding material thickness. If you organize the folds appropriately, you can have flat packing capabilities, and you can have numerous variations with one systematic method. A lot of my research has focused on curved crease folding. So a straight crease is like my hands. It opens and closes like a book. It's never fixed at any particular angle. It's essentially a hinge. But when you look at a curved crease, depending on how you calibrate the arc of that curved crease, it starts to behave like a bistable structure, or you can think of it as controlled buckling. In other words, as you start to pop those curved creases into place, they actually lock at a particular angle, which makes for a much more structured form. This has a way to really transform the way we design and build. When approximately 40% of the carbon dioxide emissions in the world are associated with the built environment, I believe we have an ethical obligation to not only design and build, but also design the way in which something is built. And I think one of the recipes to design and build more sustainably is to use constraints as opportunities. I think folding is one of those possibilities. With folding, we can create long span, lightweight, deployable structures for disaster relief. I've been able to make spans of 16 feet or 22 feet with material thicknesses of just 1/16 of an inch. And these structures can front back to widths of just 12 inches. And as a result of that, I've been able to develop and build ultra-thin formwork for concrete casting, as well as reusable stay-in-place formwork for both earth as well as concrete structure. I think folding is a way to build more sustainably by using constraints as opportunities. So here's a couple quick examples. So here's a crease pattern that's 33 feet by 22 feet. It flat packs to a width of just 12 inches and then deploys into an arch like this that's spanning 16 feet with a material thickness of just 1/16 of an inch. Here's a fiberglass disc, also a foldable composite, 8 feet in diameter. Here we're removing a mask. And then collectively, we're able to fold this into a three-dimensional saddle in just 3 minutes. The reason we're able to fold it so quickly is because the material is being programmed to have zones which are rigid and zones which are flexible. Here's a wall panel that's 8 feet long, made out of one continuous sheet. Here's a column that's been cast out of paper that's just 0.4 of a millimeter thick. This is 3 meters tall. Here's a series of lightweight deployable structures. And here's another lightweight deployable structure, which we did for Google, which is spanning 22 feet with a material thickness of just 1/16 of an inch. And then here's one which I'm currently working on for the Morikami Museum in Japanese Gardens in Delray Beach, Florida. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Our next panelist is Michael Desmond. Michael, you are the only panelist with a focus on the history of architecture. So you have a unique perspective on the trajectory of the design process. As an architect, historian, and educator, please share with us how design has informed each of these aspects of your career.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to try and share my screen. How we doing? We can see that? Okay. Yeah, it's a delight to be here with everybody. MIT has been a big part of my life. I went to do a PhD in history theory and criticism after I was already a practicing architect, and slowly over the next few decades turned really to the study of how value and meaning adhere, how we approach structures of value and meaning. At MIT, the influence of Stan Anderson, of course, and Jim O'Gorman were important. Leo Marx and his views of American literature were a big influence, and work with Neil Levine at Harvard. My work is focused on the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, as you can see here, because Wright gives me an architectural vehicle through which I can address the American interpretive tradition of self and landscape, especially as that's been influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and as it engages the growth of American pragmatism, the pragmatism of William James and John Dewey and George Herbert Mead and others. You know, the idea there is understanding the world through experience in it. In terms of my background, my dad was an MIT trained architect. After the war, he was a student of Alto's. He he built a whole series of buildings in a little small southern town I grew up in, which were all very different from everything else in the town. And so I think that issues of self and community and identity were sort of tweaked in my interest from the very beginning. He was in 1960s, a house I grew up in. Um, my wife, who I met while I was at MIT, she was working at Coleman McKinley Woods, and I have had a small practice here in Louisiana. Amongst those buildings is this Bluebonnet Swamp Nature Center here in Baton Rouge, but closed the office about 12 years ago to focus more really on my research work on Wright. And Wright provides two things. This one is the remarkable diversity of form making in the late 1930s, where buildings like Falling Water, the Johnson Wax Building, the Florida Southern College, and Taliesin West, to name just a few, were all virtually being done at the same time, all with completely different form languages. Kind of a watershed moment, really, in architecture history, I think, and the desire to sort of understand what he was up to and how he could do that. It led me to the study of agency through the lens of American pragmatism. This, of course, is the site of Taliesin in Wisconsin, also a breakthrough building, the way in which it engages its landscape and highlights not only the immediate features, but the regional context of its landscape, the regional characteristics of its landscape as a setting for agency. If you read his writings about Taliesin, he goes on and on about all the things he wanted to be able to do there, all the crops he would grow, the animals he would raise, the communal activities, and creating a place for that that's distributed about the site and facilitates all these different things as a source of meaning and growth. It's really a very different way of approaching how value gets established, turning away from kind of the old Aristotelian notion of absolutes and universals as a source of meaning to a much more pertinent interest in the immediate and the things that we want to accomplish and how architecture provides a setting for those things. These buildings, I think, probably most of you know pretty well. Falling Water, his use of the horizontal and vertical as abstractions of the way the landscape functions, especially the use of water as it pools horizontally and then drops and changes state. The building engaging the different materiality, not presenting itself as an object or really almost not as a comprehensible form until you
2 minutes.
leave it and climb down into the stream bed and get a view back, that sort of classic view, which for me really is evocative of this tradition, interpretive tradition of American self and community in terms of landscape, as you see in the early 19th century, mid 19th century painting here of kindred spirits in the Adirondacks. And then at the same time, he's doing something like this. He's in the desert, a very different environment, working on Taliesin West and providing a series of forms that show us how we can live a great life in the desert, highlighting the relationship to the geology and to the sun and the breeze, shade and shadow. At virtually the same time, amongst the sinkhole landscape of Central Florida in the citrus groves, the forms of Florida Southern College, also very different. And then, of course, the Johnson Wax Building, creating an internal environment, addressing the role of individual fulfillment in the context of group, which I think is very important. I want to put in a pitch as I go through this for the work that Avery Library at Columbia has done now. Virtually all of Wright's drawings are readily available through JSTOR, and it gives you access to 1,200 projects, 700 unbuilt designs. The second aspect of his work that really fuels my research is interest in a whole series of unbuilt houses with circular themed designs, beginning in some ways with the Jacobs hemicycle in 1942, and the way in which the circle and the use of arcs. Emerson's got a great line about the circle. He says that when we see an arc, in our imagination, we complete it. We reach out and bring in the end of the story, the completion of the story. And all of these, for me, follow his perceptual idea of the eye as the first circle and the horizon which it forms is the second. Houses like the Haldorn, unbuilt Haldorn project, which was in Carmel, to be in Carmel, and engages the ebb and flow of the Pacific Ocean there,
Right
which is so
time.
dramatic. Houses like the Hargrove House at 45 outside of San Francisco, the use of the circle, and of course the Morris House projects overlooking the Golden Gate, which the end of the road for the automobile facing the beauty of the Pacific Ocean. And then one of the most remarkable is the second house he designed for Edgar and especially Lillian Kaufman in Palm Springs, known as the Boulder House, at a remarkable spot where the Taquito Falls provided this Palm Spring oasis for the Coahuila Indians for millennia, really there. Fresh water falling down, Taquito's water falling down. A remarkable building that engages your perceptual apparatus with the landscape in blurring the relationships between those two, making reference, it appears, to the Coahuila creation myths. Here, a picture of the moon and her waters. And then today, the kinds of basketry that they have with a lot of the same sort of imagery. In terms of our three prompts, I think recognition that the things we value can be made alive in the present moment, responding to the surrounding environment through inclusive architectonics, interactions with formative aspects and agents in the natural world, conceptions of form as expressions of balance, and paying attention to the specific conditions of generation and direct increments of justice, and using concepts of community and cooperation as tools to investigate the world. And just a few thoughts, one from William James, that our minds are not here simply to copy a reality that's already complete, and writes, nature seeds from us not imitation or mimesis, but interpretation, and Dewey's succinct observation that what exists coexists.
Thank you. We're at time.
Thank you, Michael. Our next presenter panelist is Anne Louis. Anne, your work spans from innovative global projects to deeply rooted projects for underserved communities in Chicago. How does your practice use design to solve problems across scales and using collaboration?
And thanks, Aldante. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So starting with this question about across scales, I thought I'd share a little bit about my family, since lately I've been reflecting on how their history has impacted my trajectory as a designer. My parents were immigrants. You see them on the left there, I think, looking wonderfully stylish on one of their early dates to Macau. They moved to the US from Hong Kong, but also kind of unconventionally, my grandparents were also immigrants. My dad's mom was when she moved to New York, was part of the first US ladies garment workers factories that was unionized. And even more unconventionally, my great-great-grandparents were also immigrants. They moved, my grandmother's uncle moved to Mexico during the Chinese Exclusion Act. And he was a paper son, which meant that he bought papers fraudulently so he could arrive in the United States when Chinese people were barred from doing so during that period. I think, and you can see some of the pictures of my mom's family on the right. I've been thinking about this a lot because when I was growing up, my dad did work for a civil rights organization in San Francisco's Chinatown. You can see him there on the right with the arrow pointing to him a little bit slightly less stylish a few years later. But he worked for an organization called Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco, which is still going strong today. On the bottom left, CAA was involved with some of the early organizing for Asian American groups on the West Coast after the murder of Vincent Chin. And you can see here my dad's mentor, Henry Durr, with Reverend Jesse Jackson. They worked across Black, Brown, and Asian American communities to fight for things like workers' rights, tenants' rights, and a multilingual census in California. And I say this, my mom was a public school teacher teaching Cantonese and Mandarin, as well as English as a second language to people, many of whom were recent immigrants. Because I said that I didn't want to do what my parents did. I wanted to get as far away from them as possible. I don't know, some like 18-year-old energy. So first I went to work for SOM after I graduated from undergrad. But while I was at SOM, while I was learning kind of wonderful things about multidisciplinary practice, I felt like I hadn't yet answered the questions for myself about urbanism, around why we build and who we build for. And so that's when I went to MIT. And that's a picture of my desk on the left there. You can see I'm like, I don't know, drinking some sort of probably bad for me soda at the time. But what I did was I went to MIT for history, theory, and criticism. And I studied the history of SOM, which I thought of as being kind of the corporate firm par excellence. But while doing so, I found out that kind of along the way, SOM had actually done a lot of work in what I called extra architectural activities. So research and development, advertising, work with the computer group that I found to be actually very interesting and parallel with the corporate practice. And I was interested also in the way that the corporate practice had itself been designed, that things that as a practitioner, as a young practitioner, I took for granted had really been constructed very recently over the last 100 and 150 years in practice in the United States. So I was also part of Office US when Anna Milyaki led it at MIT, which documented 100 years of practice by American architects overseas. And I think while I was in grad school, because there was this kind of exhibition energy in the air, me and a group of friends were also doing these kind of scrappy exhibitions at the same time. We did this project called Circus for Construction. And this is, I think, out by where some of Marie's projects are in the shipyard where the ICA extension is now, which at the time was the only place which would let us build this crazy thing on the end of a 30-foot gooseneck trailer. We did this project called Circus for Construction, which we took exhibitions to locations to have conversations about architecture on site rather than in kind of white cube spaces, trying to find different ways to meet people where they are to talk about the built environment in ways that matter to them. So we pulled this around to 5 cities on the back of a truck, most likely underinsured. And I think it was a way to start thinking about architecture as building platforms. And then after I graduated, I was teaching and we had the opportunity to apply for the US Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. And we did represent the US in 2018 during the first Trump administration on this topic, Dimensions of Citizenship, which explored questions of belonging in the built environment from the body
2
to the
minutes.
cosmos. I think that this work, along with the kind of scrutiny about the history of practice, led to where we are today. Future Firm is an office of 8. We're based in Chicago. And I think the goal of what we do is to both challenge how we practice and who we practice for. So that means work for people in communities of color across the city of Chicago, including in disinvested communities. As you see here on the right, the bottom right is a transformation of 4 vacant lots into a public plaza, as well as speculative proposals like Office of the Public Architect, which ask if when accused of a crime, you are entitled to a public defender. If when you are issued a building violation, should you also be entitled to a public architect? And so maybe I'll just kind of cruise through these last slides. I'll say when I was a student, I felt like architecture was like this, a kind of expanding boundary in which the agency of architecture in the built environment and in social cultural contexts and economic contexts was ever expanding. But in practice, I often felt it to be like this. And anybody who has negotiated a contract lately knows that the kind of risk management that goes into curtailing what an architect does is really tremendous. And I think in all our projects, we try to question this owner-architect triangle, whether it's through this project called Midnight Palace, which was dedicated to night shift workers in a city where there were many of them, or this project, Revolution Workshop, that does workforce development, but used its own trainees and its employer partners to build a publicly funded workforce development center on the West Side, or a project like, and I'm sorry, my slides are lagging now for a minute, or this project Hem House, which was a prototype for an affordable, naturally occurring, affordable single-family house that we did design, build, develop on, and when it sold was the fifth least expensive single-family house in the city of Chicago. Ultimately, if you layer all these contexts together, we can see that practice, if we challenge it, can start to go back to maybe the ambitions that I had for it as a student and the visions I think many of us hold for it as a discipline as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Our last panelist is Gustavo Rodriguez. Gustavo, from your background in the Dominican Republic to decades of practicing at large firms in New York, working locally on housing and civic projects and globally on mixed-use developments, tell us how you designed a practice that remains socially driven and supportive with a mentoring model strategy.
Sure. Thank you, Aldante. It's been a fun journey, and I think it's interesting to have to kind of summarize this like years of my life in a set of slideshows. But interestingly enough, I'll also like Michael start with Frank Lloyd Wright. As I was growing up in the Dominican Republic, my dad had studied architecture, and he presented me this building when I must have been 8 years old. And I was immediately drawn to it and the relationship of the built form and nature. And to me, the notion of the river running through the house, running through the living room of the house, not necessarily underneath it, but really talked about integrating nature and architecture. And to me, that was kind of a very similar. And growing up in the Dominican Republic in the tropics, I didn't have to worry about weather rain barriers and weather screens. So immediately that kind of set a big tone for the way that I approach architecture. Followed then by MIT, where I really gravitated towards the mens et manus, the mind at hand. Smarks O2, by the way. Shout out to my Smarks in the audience. But the idea of mens, the mind, the thinking, and my love of Legos that has gone from the first time, and the rules I set up, and manus, the hand crafting, and the idea of nature and materiality really built a lot. I especially remember Bill Porter's class, Design Inquiry, where we talked about the silent game and the rules of Legos and how you could take a series of rules and repeat them and aggregate them to create an expression, but also how those rules can then be creatively manipulated to create something that was more than just a dogmatic representation. So that idea of rules and manipulations has always been critical to my thinking. Similar with nature, the idea of this kind of verticality of nature, the processes that you see in nature, and the same thing that nature follows its own set of rules, and how these rules and operations can have an impact on form and space. I remember having a dream about trying to kind of being very anxious about creating a specific sculptural model. All designers have anxiety dreams about design. And then in the dream, I remember grabbing the wet napkin and just like crushing it in my hand, and the form that I wanted resulted from that action. So the idea of form being a resultant of these constraints is really critical to me. And I was lucky enough to be able to explore this concept of working with nature and the things that nature gives us, and as opposed to working against nature. And nature, thinking about it from the bigger point of view, New York on the left, Santo Domingo on the right. The idea of the built environment coexisting with nature and how these things come to play. So after MIT, I moved to New York where I was a partner at FX Collaborative and was lucky enough to be able to work on leading the design of a lot of great projects. From a hotel in Azerbaijan, who sits at the foot of this medieval fort, and the idea of the architecture is another one of these sheer rock faces. A proposal for residential building in Gowanus, where the public realm then not only goes into the ground floor, but also spirals through up, and you have this integration at all levels of nature and building. To quite literally my love of Legos, this conceptual model is probably the most accurate representation of it. The vertical mass, the striated mass, the planes, and how that building then, which is the Ashland in Brooklyn, became this play of layers that basically was a grown-up version of all the townhouses around it. And this one across the street from MIT, if you might recognize the Legal Seafoods in the corner there, that's right around the Kendall Square. This is Proto. So I was very lucky to come back and be able to do something close to campus. And in this case, it was really understanding the context and understanding that nature, that environment that is around us, and the constraints in this case of the built environment, and how that mapped into the surface of the very tight site. And the facade became this. The rule of the facade was closer when it's enclosed and more open when you have light and view. So the expression and the design of the building came from just analyzing and letting the forces of the context come into play. And then finally, from my FX years, the idea of the vertical industrial building that then gets inserted with these outdoor spaces that create these outdoor environmental, outdoor natural spaces and social spaces for the people to work. So in the end, I mean, in the end, this really came down to this work of a lot of collaboration with people, and all the work that I've shown you before has been with FX Collaborative. But what I really took from it was the idea of practice. And in this case, to the point of the question, the practice really, when I started, was like this: bunch of big firms on one side and a bunch of small firms on another, and kind of this medium-sized firms that started to work. And the more that things have evolved, it's become the middle has been reduced in size, and the smaller firms have been kind of absorbed. And this is where the idea for GR Design Lab came in, which is really a new approach of design delivery and how to bring that big firm expertise that I showed you before to a different way of delivering design, where as a small piece, I can then plug into different places and in different modes. So I am now post FX, now that I've opened my firm, which is GR Design Lab, I've acted as design advisor for FX in this large-scale project at the Kingsbridge Armory, where I'm helping them navigate the complexity of this. In this case, I was a design consultant. The developer wanted a Dominican designer to bring that Dominican culture into this RFP. So I brought this notion of not only the public spaces of the city, but also the way of living. A design architect in the Dominican Republic, as collaborating with another firm to design this corporate office building. And as my own design practice, where I'm also working in the Dominican Republic for commercial headquarters. So really the ability of the small piece and being able to plug in and to aggregate, I think talks to a bit of what Anne was saying about how we can push around, and either you can kind of create your own space or just be able to plug in different spaces. Because I think in the end, the smaller pieces, I think, have more fun. The smaller pieces are the ones that let you plug in and rearrange and create all these other things. So I really am the idea of being one of these pieces and can help aggregate to bring that expertise and to bring that impact and raise the impact of smaller firms to at all scales. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Gustavo. And I want to thank all of our panelists again. We are going to continue the conversation with a few questions to our guests. Feel free to submit questions to our Q&A. But to get started, Andrea will begin with a question to jump us off.
Thank you. And as well, thank you to all of our panelists and for sharing your work and in the context of this dialogue that we've been having over the last couple of years. One question, I'm going to try to merge a question from Maral in the chat with one that we had come up with, which is, and I think Joseph, but anyone else, we would love to hear your thoughts about, do you think it's possible that AI could eventually engage in a kind of holistic design reasoning process which, we would, on this panel would see traditionally to be the role of the architect. And I think Miral has framed that slightly another way, well, with a particular focus on can AI be drawn upon to reduce climate change impacts for underserved, underrepresented communities in architecture. So kind of two different ways of looking at how AI might be incorporated into practice.
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. I think for me, before I get into what I think would happen, what I predict will happen in the future, I think we can also look at the past as a way to understand the future. And so, in the 1960s, especially in 1964, there was a conference at the BAC that questioned how is the computer going to change the practice of architecture? And some of the conversations we have about AI are pretty similar. But if you look at that conference, there was a couple of different presentations that showed drastically different trajectories. So the Lincoln Lab at MIT created Sketchpad, but where basically they're digitizing drawing by hand. But whether I draw by hand on paper or I draw by hand on a tablet, fundamentally I'm still thinking through the act of drawing. So it doesn't change the way I think. So it's just a tool. It's a tool to augment an ability. And on the other hand, the Boeing company presented something drastically different. They were able to write an algorithm to generate three-dimensional form. So here is something which never could have been imagined without the computer. Suddenly the computer wasn't just a tool to augment the individual's ability. The computer was an instrument to think with. And so that becomes really interesting. And I think with AI, we're going to see both in the future. We're going to see some things that just automate tasks. But I think the more exciting part is where AI starts to become looked at less as one specific tool and more about how we can zoom out and think of it in an analog sense as like an interdisciplinary collaboration. So how can I, just like the way I might collaborate with a chemist or a structural engineer or someone else, different expertise to work towards one common goal, with AI, I believe we have the ability to start designing networks where, again, multiple types of neural networks are working according to their strengths, and we can start to really orchestrate that collaborative dialogue to tackle very challenging problems. Might be urban conditions that are prone to flooding, or reducing the carbon footprint of how we build and others, or tackling affordable housing and understanding the kind of zoning regulations and restrictions associated with it. But again, that's where I start to think it becomes really interesting when we don't look at just one tool, but really about how we can start designing this kind of network of processes. And I think it could, really reduce the carbon footprint of how we build and tackle some of the most challenging problems of our time.
Great, thank you. And I think anyone else from the panel want to offer thoughts on that question? Otherwise, we can move on to the next. Just giving a chance here. I think, Michael, you were going to take the next question. Michael Joyce?
Yes. Thank you, Andrea. I want to thank the panelists today for sharing their work as well. Wonderful work from all us in MITarch alumni. Looking great. But let me ask this question, and this might be for Anne and Michael and others. How can architects shape new spaces by integrating policy, advocacy, and equity-focused frameworks?
Maybe I can jump in to start, and then Michael, I'd love to hear what you think. So in addition to running the practice at Future Firm, I also teach. I'm an assistant professor of practice at the University of Michigan. And last semester last year, I had the joy of teaching an elective called Building Code as Battleground. What I did with students is in Chicago and all the city council committee meetings, there's something called a public comment period where anyone from the public can stand up and spend 3 minutes talking about anything they want, as long as it's related to the agenda of the meeting. And often in the zoning, building standards, and landmarks committee, that's people who are concerned about a development of some kind, that they want it to happen or they don't want it to happen. But I had my students prepare 3-minute presentations or lectures, speeches on zoning or building code reforms that they wanted to enact. And some of them were things that were already in conversation and consideration, like single stair egress for missing and middle housing. Others were things that they came up with all on their own, like there should be a dedicated 311 hotline for ADA accessibility violations. That came from their own lived experience. And I think what was really exciting to me about it was, of course, at first I thought about it for the students, that it was about talking to architects about how we can be advocates around building code, around zoning code, but also just about the built environment and in political environments in general. But then what I realized was it made the aldermen and the city council part of our classroom for the duration of those presentations. So they became part of our elective at Michigan on building code. And I think that for me, it's really important for architects to remember that things like code and law and policy around the built environment aren't things that have been handed down from above. Like law is not this fixed thing that is written in stone, but is actually the product of the kind of advocacy and reform and agitation that architects have historically been part of and should still be part of. So I think that attitude can apply no matter what topic you're interested in, and has led, for me personally, to lots of opportunities to become parts of those conversations. Because I think in any city that people are in, you'll find that if there's a topic that you care strongly about, one, if you become the super wonk in it, you'll be the local expert, and two, you'll likely find other people who want to be agitators around the same issue as well.
Thank you, Anne. Michael, yes.
I would I just want to emphasize the idea that architecture is above everything else a form of communication. It's a communicative gesture, and it's uniquely powerful, I think, in that because it relies so much on empathy and the bodily character of our experience. It's a way in which we can communicate most intimately with the broadest levels of social organization. And the idea of perception of space in architecture really, I think, is about agency. And I think we're starting to understand that more and more than we used to. Some of the work we saw today from Marie Law and from Robert Benson in particular, I thought is really acutely about that, that the building presents a possibility for your action and the success of your action in a certain context. And that seems to me a uniquely powerful thing that we're able to do. And applying that to all the conditions of equity and social justice and opportunity that we find, I think is really a powerful thing.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to the question and answer before we move on? Okay, I think we'll move on to our third question, which will be presented by Aldante.
Yeah, so I would like to kind of follow up on something that Michael said, and this kind of question of agency and the way that it needs to, or suggested in our discussion, the way that it needs to kind of change or be more impactful within our profession. And I think he hit it right on the head between Marie and Robert and their current practices. So if you two wanted to discuss kind of your position on agency and the importance in your practice.
I think for us, we continually repeat design with rather than for. So we really want to engage the folks that are going to be part of the project. And that's not really just the people paying for it. That's the people around it, the people we hope that will benefit from it. We're really good, I think, at being architects. We're really not good at being other people. So to think that we understand their perspective, to think we understand exactly what they're going through is a bit of a fallacy. So getting them literally directly involved in the process and making sure that we think through the experiences that we're trying to create and get their feedback, their input, change the design. I can't tell you how many times we've actually changed a design based on feedback, and it's not that I didn't like this or I didn't like that. It's not a demographic necessarily. It could be age groups too. It's really funny designing a public community center and hearing that teenagers need nap space, and coming through with that. And you hear where the older folks want running tracks and the kids don't want to run at all if they don't have to. It can make the whole process a lot more fun. I think get a better result.
Yeah, I think a lot of that resonates with our practice as well. And I'll just say that, like, for our work at Landing Studio, most all of our projects do not start with a brief for a physical spatial design. They usually start with a kind of a problem in some way, or a set of questions that a community is asking about their environment. Like, how do we live with this overpass in our neighborhood? What can we do about it? Or why has our park disappeared over time because of it? And so, in terms of this question of design as a form of communication, the design process is a kind of long and searching one for us. And a lot of questions get answered over time and not by presupposing like what an outcome is. That's something that we kind of arrive at over a lot of time. Sometimes it helps to have kind of intermediate projects happening in the mix there as well. But I think that, as kind of Robert is saying, you definitely you have to know that you're bringing a set of skills as an architect. And what we see our role is kind of listening to what are the issues in the community and using those skills to help visualize things. I mean, there's kind of nothing like using drawings and representations to be able to kind of embody a lot of ideas and have a conversation. And a lot of times that's something that's missing in conversations to kind of carry forward, getting at a kind of solution for something that's really been challenging a place. So we see that as something that we can bring to the table when we're kind of, meeting groups with these kind of questions.
Thank you. I think we'll take a question from the Q&A. Cal has asked, how has climate change changed your practice over the years, or if it has? He suggests we have gone from mitigation to adaptation and now resiliency. He wonders if your approach is your approach through better connection to nature, better connection to energy, life cycle, low carbon, et cetera, or all of the above. That's for anyone.
Well, I'll jump in. Sorry, real quick. I've noticed how there's far fewer projects that seem to want to get LEED certification and focus on that. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because we're doing a lot of things automatically that would qualify for that. And we're hearing that regularly. I think what's interesting to me is that we are working through resiliency. We designed the first EF5 tornado resistant space in Illinois for a school. And I think that kind of understanding that we may not be able to change the way or affect the changes of the climate, but we can survive it and thrive within it, is an interesting perspective. I think a lot of things that we're doing, we do anyway, and we're finding new ways to convince clients that having their own energy, producing energy as part of the project is something very, very worthy of their focus. So we're sort of almost subversive in our approach, I guess.
I'll build on that, saying that uh, for a long time, I was lucky enough that my first project at FX was a LEED Platinum headquarters building, and I learned a lot. And I've been able to work on several LEED Platinum buildings. And the interesting thing was that in the 20 years that I was there, it went from being like a push to being basically code requirement. And I think that the codes have moved so much further along that have made a lot of these sustainability things be baked in, that we stopped talking about it. But I think the important thing is, I think resiliency addresses the now and the things that are happening. And we have to start, as a designer, to me, the way that has changed for me is that I'm starting to think about the new normal. And it's not about the random storm that's going to come every 100 years, but now there are storms all the time, and we have to design with that in mind. On the flip side of all of that, what I would like to change is that we have, we live in a world that everything is, there's always a post-apocalyptic movie that we're looking at. Everything is about the dire future. And I think we've lost the optimism of design and the optimism in the future. And I think we're going through hard times with a lot of things going on in the world. But I think design and designers have the role to kind of dream of that positive future and look at that climate change through a positive lens. So what are the things that we can do in design in a way that's going to pivot that? I think we need to explore more of that space.
Yeah, I'll jump in as well. So, when I was a student at MIT, and I was interested in demystifying, digital tools, and I got into mathematics, and then I got into geometry. But then at some point, I looked at the geometries I was making, and I said, "Yeah, we can build this. There's lots of ways of building it." But then I started thinking to myself, well, just because we can build it with our current means and methods doesn't mean we should, especially when 40% of the carbon dioxide emissions in the world are associated with the built environment. And so that kind of personal critique of my own work drove me to look at folding, where as soon as you fold something, you gain structural depth, you can have flat packing capabilities, numerous variations with one systematic method. So I started really thinking much more about almost like engineering or performance-based criteria as a way to start tackling it through constraints. And then I also started to engage industry a lot more and other kind of experts in other disciplines like chemistry to try to understand how we can truly make just a little bit of a difference. Because, I mean, even if you can just, most of the, we all say concrete's, a terrible building material, but even if we can just find a way to reduce the amount of concrete we use, that already makes a major impact on the way we build and carbon dioxide, emissions. So I'm also interested in these kind of incremental improvements rather than necessarily just completely saying, we're going to wipe all the kind of building means and methods that we already have in place. But these little advancements are really important to the kind of work that I'm trying to do right now. And again, what was said earlier about clients and listening to clients and creating those dialogues, the same goes for industry. We have to understand their inner workings, their constraints, and figure out how to create dialogues with them to advance that as well. But that's how I've changed a lot.
I think I'd say that I think that our conceptions of architectonics, of architectural elements, and the way all the pieces fit together, have to be much more inclusive. They have to include aspects, tendencies, and characteristics of the natural environment in our sites, so that we don't just see the building as an object put in a place, but that as an object or as a series of interactive, interdependent processes that that that, that work with the environment in broader ways. So much more inclusive concept of architectonics.
Yeah, maybe just quick, very local thought on that. And Michael, I think you're right to connect buildings to their context. And I'll give everyone a very specific example of this. To me, the question of sustainability really has to be tied to questions of equity and uneven development in cities. For example, in Chicago, if you want to do an all-electric building, you will find, even if you want to just convert a existing building to commercial HVAC, you need three-phase power. You will find that many places in the south and west sides of Chicago doesn't have three-phase power easily accessible. The cost for ComEd to bring out that power is substantial and is a burden on the owner. In some places in the grid, we are finding in Chicago, for example, in South Shore, there is not enough power in the grid to bring three-phase power to multiple commercial projects at the same time. So the challenge of developing sustainable projects is not just in the code expectations or the client's goals or the capacity of the designer to do it, but it also has to be that there has to be civic and political will to create equitable development broadly to make these projects happen. And that is exactly as Michael said, understanding that a thing isn't an object in a tabula rasa, but it happens within a kind of historical social context that in many American cities is a context that's been marked by disinvestment.
Yeah, one way of thinking about that is to think about form and how we evaluate form, and not thinking about the value of form in terms of abstractions and universals, but that form represents a balance of forces, and it's always temporary in some sense. And what are all those forces being held into balance, and what are they asking of each other, and what kind of achievement is that? That's the way I try and think of it.
One other thing that comes to mind based on what you were saying, Anne, in particular, is I had one time done a consulting project for Amar Kamash in Jordan, and I was surprised to hear that, you know, most of their buildings are actually incredibly sustainable because they're building out of earth and maybe 2% cement, and it's almost all the building materials come from a 30-mile radius. And so most of the fees for the construction go straight into the labor, which is wonderful, rather than, you know, the material itself. But they have other challenges, which are things like cultural sustainability projects. So they came to me because they had this goat hair textile that they've been making for like 1,000 years. It's like a heritage craft, but they don't know how to use it anymore for buildings because it leaks. So it's like, how do you now find another way of elevating this heritage craft that they don't want to die, but it doesn't work anymore for the use that it previously had? So, you know, in the end, I found a way to make music for kind of acoustic paneling and things of that nature. But it's really interesting because the location and how you define what is sustainable to that, you know, and then again, that's not something where, you know, in that case, I didn't design anything. I just tried to teach them a new skill because I don't know enough about their local culture and their means of living. But it's again, I think location is definitely part of a larger answer for this.
Well, and it also seems that, which I'm sure is obvious, but that resilience really must also be social or societal resilience as much as it is climatic and environmental. So, which I think all your comments are relating to that. We have a couple of other two other questions from the chat that relate back to sort of practice. And so one person has asked, how do your practices address rising costs of living for employees? Or put more broadly, how do you think about allocation of design fees within firms, particularly in your firm, particularly in relation to equity access and who's able to afford to stay in the profession? I mean, I think this ties back to the idea that maybe for some of you, the engagements that you have as a firm or as a consultant are not, not as they're not the traditional design architect role, but more about engagement or advocacy. So I think we're curious about your thoughts. Anyone could really, but maybe Marie, Robert, and Gustavo might be slightly more appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, supporting the people that work with us is incredibly important in our office, of course, as it is with any firm, I'd imagine. We are very small and we, need to stay small in order to be able to do the projects the way that we want to. We get very involved in fundraising for our own projects and, maybe it's surprising, maybe it's not, but there actually is funding available to do those kinds of things. We work pretty hand in hand with municipalities and local advocacy groups to apply for grants. And a lot of the work that we do in terms of, helping frame the problems and questions that are facing communities are pretty valuable in terms of being able to secure funds to build projects. And so that's kind of part of our model of practice. And it's also just not biting off more than we chew. I mean, we're pretty careful about what we take on as projects and make sure that there's a good alignment of, goals between ourselves and the groups that we're working with.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to add? Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, there's another question here. This is maybe a perfect ending question. It's a question from Emily. It's related to the initiative itself. And she thanks us all for the informative and engaging presentations. The panelists couldn't be more different in their work and diversity. However, the commonality of MIT architecture alumni is a selfless passion for the design of the built environment. Inquiry is at the heart of our hearts. How and what can we as MIT architecture alumni do for each other and the world? That's an open question for all of us.
Open question. It's a nice question.
I'll
Thank you, Emily.
I'll take a first pass at it, which I think what I really appreciated about MIT, it's in its open-ended research and collaboration process. And it's always been about people being able to aggregate around things and everything being very transparent and open. And I think what we as alumni can do is precisely continue to tackle that, to bring that spirit forward and to continue that collaboration. I think the issues that we're talking about here are not in the world, are not going to kind of go away by one magic wave of the wand. And we have the ability and the skills to collaborate against with each other, as opposed to against each other.
Yeah, maybe for me, the thing that I loved most about MIT, I remember somebody said to me, it's like the time you spend here, you'll spend developing the questions that you'll need the rest of your life to work on, rather than that you would answer them in the duration of our time there. And I think that's true. And the kind of MIT way of asking good and hard questions about everything at every scale, and that chasing those questions is meaningful in and of themselves, I think is something that I took away. And I think we can all cultivate in any area of practice that we're in. I guess I'll say for me, it's great through this MITArcha to meet other Chicago alum. And I'll say I think the folks in the Midwest, we need to gather up a little bit of steam here to kind of bring the Cambridge energy to the Midwest. And I would really value anybody to reach out and do that collaboratively going forward.
Yeah, it's just obvious to do more of the kind of fun right now. The fact that you guys have created this format and maintain these networks it's really exciting, and I think participating in it certainly is helping me. And then also, I about 8, 9 years ago, I started a Doctor of Design program here at LSU that turned out Doctor of Design and Cultural Preservation that wound up being extremely interdisciplinary. We had maybe 12 to 15 very diverse units across the whole campus working with our students. And I learned to do that at MIT. That's where I got from. I mean, Stan's History Theory and Criticism program um, seemed to be a foundation of it.
I think when I was a student at MIT, also like Terry Knight's course, where she was teaching inquiry to computation, she taught us to understand how to identify research questions, how to identify contributions, how to create your own inquiry or discourse within that. And so, that kind of rigor of really understanding a field and then understanding how we can add some knowledge to that or make a real contribution. I think that was really powerful for me. And even like I know within my own work, which is very specific in folding, I understand, okay, it's a small contribution, but this is my small contribution that'll help the way I can. And then others will, have their other contributions. But I think that's one of the biggest beauties of MIT and architecture in general is, there's so many futures. There's not one future to the discourse of architecture, and we have lots of ways of contributing. And then MIT doesn't try to position you to only do one way, but for yourself as an individual to ask those questions and create your own kind of trajectory.
I think there's one other question that did come in that thinks about maybe the future of the profession, and we still have just 3 more minutes, so maybe a few of you might be interested to address that. The question is from Ahmed Idris. What advice would the current practitioners on the panel like to give to those currently teaching about what skills they would like them to instill in students before they graduate? I know, Robert, we had a conversation about tools and when we were thinking about this panel way back when.
Yeah, I don't even remember what I said, Andrea, but I but I can say that creativity, judgment, and the ability to frame the context of whatever it is you're working on is instrumental. And there are many tools, and we should be savvy about those tools. We should test a lot of the things Joseph's been talking about, push the machines, test the machines. But at the end of the day, we have to be creative. We have to use really good judgment, and we have to make sure that we really understand the problems behind the problems. And from that context, I think we can affect serious change.
I'd add too that I think that one of the things I see in all of us today is a sense of design as inquiry. That it's a process of asking questions and understanding the scope of the world we're in.
I'll add anecdotally that every time I hired somebody when I was at FX, it was because I was able to have a clear conversation with them about intent and how that intent was followed through. And so it's a soft skill, right? We're focused on the computer skills. You're going to do that. They're going to figure it out. If they don't, they're going to come and learn some of it in the profession. But that ability as a young designer to come in and say, this is what I want to do, and this is how I did it, is rare actually. Because sometimes they just get so caught up into is speaking about every single item that they did, as opposed to kind of thinking about what they tried to achieve. And to me, the important thing about it is that it shows you that down the road, you're going to be able to have a design conversation with that person about the project that you're working together. So that skill, I think, is critical especially as we move forward in a world that's more about the thinking and less about the doing.
Yeah, I might add to that. One of the things we try to teach in some of our courses here at FAU, in particular courses that are partnered with industry or community partners, is to teach students to listen and ask questions. And that's really important, but it goes beyond also not just asking the client and creating a dialogue there, but when you're working with a tool, it's also, are you going to choose to listen to the tool, or are you going to force the tool to work a certain way? If you're working with the material, you're going to listen to the material, the wood's bending a certain way, or are you going to force it to do something it doesn't want to do? So I think just in general, teaching students to listen to whatever constraint is associated with the project, whether it's environmental, technological, or directly with the community you're working with. But yeah, learning to listen is super important.
Okay, if no one else has any other questions, then any last closing remarks from Eldante and Michael? And we think we want to extend our thanks to everyone for joining us today, all of our guests, and to MIT Alumni Association, Moana and Kevin for organizing and facilitating this discussion. And lastly, our illustrious panelists, thank you so much for your commitment and faith and interest in talking with us over the past year and in putting this together. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you
Thank you.
all.